So please know that you will be, this will be publicly available. And then Matt, if I could ask you to please drop the agenda into the chat, and I'm going to hand the floor over to Keegan and team, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, looking forward to giving another update today and really getting to the home stretch of our analytical work here. Before I dive in, Michelle, by the way, are we sharing the slides yet, Kathy?
Yep.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Matt. Before I dive in, just wanted to say thanks for all the stakeholder feedback we've gotten so far. We've gotten really a lot of thoughtful comments throughout this process. This last several months, is and was really the time to impact and influence and provide thoughts on how this is going. So we've appreciated all those that have been involved and taken the time to sit on these webinars and provide your input. Because the way that this work is set up with our presentation next month, and kind of presenting the findings, everything that you've shared with us to date, has been really helpful. And we've had some really critical pieces of input that materially impacted the results. The assistance we've received on the bus bar mapping, engagement we've had early on, developing the transmission topology, and other ancillary comments, which are all important, but there's some really key areas. Validating the capacity expansion work that we did was all really helpful. So I just wanted to start with a thank you from our study team. We really appreciated it, and now we can dive in. So I've got my perfunctory opening slides here. If you can go to the next slide, Matt. These have been the same slides throughout the project, just for people that are new. But what I include these here is just to remind people of what we're trying to do. So the goal here is to conduct a holistic transmission assessment of Colorado's long-range transmission needs. We want to bake into this assessment projects that are already planned, and we've done that. And we also want to engage stakeholders in this analysis as we kind of march towards this transmission gap analysis. So the primary goal is to focus on a future and get a view of what these transmission needs are for Colorado over this long range time frame, and then determine if any of those needs are already being met. This is critical as a strategic input to CETA's efforts to help them prioritize, review, understand, interpret, rank project proposals and partnership opportunities that they get. This does not mean it's the only thing that CETA is going to take into account. There's a lot of complexities in transmission. I hope everybody appreciates that this is a roadmap of sorts for the state as it relates to transmission, right? The project concepts that we identify are going to change. This is not a construction plan. They're going to be responsive to the direct, needs of the system, but it's really helpful for the state to jump out 20 years and look at, what might be needed down the road. So that's what we're trying to do. And today specifically, we're doing a few things. We're reviewing the results of the congestion assessment that identified some additional projects we've added to our portfolio. In addition to that, we've done some additional alternative analysis and other work on the portfolio. We presented at Stakeholder Meeting 3. So Tom is going to present what we're calling our final reference case transmission portfolio. This is really the key thing that we'll be presenting at the Public Service Commission next month. The goal was to really give them an overview of the methodology, but really to focus in on, hey, here's a roadmap of transmission for the state directionally on the gap we see. We also have some additional scenario results to present today, and I almost wanted to start with this, a handful of study findings, which is really just an aggregation, summary of what we've seen working together over the past several months. And I'm hoping we have enough time to have a little dialogue on that. I'd like to get people's verbal feedback and things that they've seen and appreciate from this work and could see being important but I'll share with you our views first. So next slide here. I was excited to go through this yesterday on the study goals and the key attributes, and to see that we had done all the things in these little circles. So that's good. And so that means we've stayed largely consistent with our study scope that we set out to execute at the beginning. Recognize that in some cases we did react to information that we got along the way. Go to the next slide. For those of you that have time later and want to understand more deeply what the study is and what it isn't, this is a very good slide to kind of let sink in a little bit, right? We're not trying to redo or undermine any Colorado transmission planning that has taken place. We're not trying to select an individual project. And we're not saying that if a project isn't listed here, it's not a good idea either, right? So there's a lot of effective and valuable transmission options out there. This is a view based off our study methodologies. It will change over time, and really this is not a construction plan. It's a roadmap for the state. So go to the next slide, and just another reminder of what we went through to get here today, which was a fairly complex modeling process, a first of its kind process for Colorado that started with a broad engagement on kind of the direction of this future reference case we built out. We developed a depiction of what resource needs we would need above and beyond those that are in the integrated resource plan for the first 10 years of study, stretching really the demands on the grid out through 2045. Those demands are mapped, represented in a very detailed manner, and then subject to both reliability and economic analysis. Both of those studies took into account a discrete set of planned transmission upgrades that were baked into our assessment, thereby orienting the study to focus on things that are not yet planned, out in time, that may be needed in the future. Go to the next slide. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to you, Kathy, just kind of orienting everybody there, and we can walk through a little bit of the stakeholder review and process over the last couple of months, and then I'll jump in to some of the congestion results when you and Tom are done with that.
Sure. Thank you, Keegan. So if you want to keep going here on work completed since the last meeting. Keegan, did you want to address this?
Yeah, you caught me. I forgot a slide. I was supposed to do this one. Thank you. So this is the journey we've been on since I think sometime in late June, or maybe early June when we last sat down together. So at that time we had kind of a preliminary reference case transmission portfolio that was primarily based off of deliverability upgrades, i.e. upgrades that are needed to ensure that the generation can reach loads in times of system need, right? So that's kind of a capacity event. So can we count on this generation for resource adequacy? That's a really critical type of transmission planning that's embedded in this study. It's akin to, for those utilities, a network resource designation analysis, where you kind of want to make sure that my resources can get home to serve my loads. So that was already done at the last meeting. We enhanced that study by doing a more traditional reliability analysis. So heavy summer type conditions, classic reliability analysis to see if we had any gaps. We also reevaluated our view of the corridors we were potentially needing and what reconductoring approaches we could take to make sure that our portfolio is making as much use of existing right-of-way as we could. Parallel to that work, we collected some feedback on that reference case portfolio. We weren't expecting a ton of feedback because I don't think there's been many 20-year planning studies like this in Colorado. So I think while there may have been some overlap on that 10-year horizon, right, where we were seeing some of the same things that the local transmission providers were, I think at 20 years, a lot of this, the magnitude of the need is in large part new from a technical perspective. And so correspondingly, we didn't get a ton of feedback on the expansion options, just some other ideas were floated. We did perform, as promised, a assessment of the viability of transmission alternatives for those generic projects we identified, and we did identify some opportunities to replace some of our traditional upgrades with high capacity advanced conductor technologies as a more efficient, cost-effective way to to meet the needs that we identified. Other solutions like power flow control devices, dynamic line ratings, transmission switching were not effective. There's a really good technical basis for this. In short, there's a lot of technical evidence that those technologies and what they are effective at is appropriate for incremental or interim needs for the grid. Whereas what we're seeing in our study is just the practical realities of the nature of the violations and the reliability overloads we see is that they're quite severe in a long-term time horizon. So think if you had a line and it was loaded, 300% of its emergency rating, right, or 200%. There's not a lot of these technologies that can provide that capability other than either a new line or a reconductoring or advanced conductor, which all provide incremental firm capacity. Whereas a power flow control device, dynamic line ratings, transmission switching, those are all effective at issues we might see in the 5 to 7 year horizon that are marginal in nature. If our lines are overloaded, by 5% or 10% or maybe even 20%, some of those tools can be effective. But when we tested them, we just didn't see in large part the ability of them to provide the services that we needed to maintain reliability. So that's not to discount the value of those technologies, but it is to say it's difficult to fit them in. It's a little bit of a square peg, round hole problem when you look out 20 years and we have such a large magnitude of transmission need. So Tom will talk more about the technical analysis behind that later. Number 4, we performed an economic assessment, identifying a few additional upgrades to address congestion on the system. There's about 4. I'll talk about what those were. We didn't expect there to be a lot of upgrades, but we did identify 4 additional upgrades. These are upgrades that are addressing about, constraints that had more than $20 million a year of congestion costs. So they're materially congested elements out in the 2045 horizon. Once we had this final portfolio, all of the lines we've identified, Montara Mountain Energy, Emily is going to talk a little bit and describe the routing analysis. And she's got some really interesting information about corridor usage, wildfire risk, and some holistic views of land usage associated with this portfolio. And then finally, in addition to that kind of base analysis, we completed some studies that looked at how that portfolio of transmission upgrades might change in response to scenarios that are different than our reference case. And we've got some narratives on that, showing that in a lot of cases, especially under expansive demand growth in Colorado, right, the need for transmission is going to increase drastically, right? And that's a really complicated view to say, oh, we need to build it, and that will all happen. That's not necessarily the conclusion of the report, but it is saying that, the Colorado system is not well prepared, I think, for the amount of load growth we modeled in that scenario. It would take expansive investment in the transmission system to accommodate that level of load, which I think was about 7 additional gigawatts above what our base forecast was. So depending on your views of the Colorado economy and data centers, you might think that number is, possible or not. So, but it is a point estimate, and we give a pretty good view of the impacts on the transmission system. So that is everything we've done since the last meeting in large part. A few other things I missed. So now, Kathy, I wanted to say that because a lot of that was important context to have as we go into, some of the comments we got and where we're at now for the rest of the study.
Great, thank you, Keegan. We could go on to the next slide. And I do see a question coming in the chat. Ben, we're going to give the team a little bit of time to get into their presentation, and we'll pause for questions as we get to the end here of each section. So I see it, and we will come back to it. So as far as timeline and stakeholder engagement, this is likely a familiar slide to you all. On the left side, the more formal process here, the initial report that's due to the PUC, presentation coming in late August, and the initial report in September. Stakeholder comment period, and then final report that's due to the legislature by January of 2025. And then on the informal, the engagement that we've had really going back to February, this is the 4th and final meeting for the stakeholder work. So 3 previous plus the bus bar mapping proposal. Thank you everyone for comments and feedback. As Keegan has said, it's been very instructive to the team to direct the course of this study. And of course, the ongoing informal exchange. I know several of you have emailed me on the side with input and tidbits, and really appreciate that. So final meeting today for stakeholders. Go ahead on to the next slide, please. And here again, also likely very familiar. We appreciate everyone following these guidelines. Please mute your mic, raise your hand when you have questions, maybe hold to the end of the presentations, and we'll make sure that we get you addressed. And you all have been doing a great job. Please be respectful in your comments, share your ideas, and do leave some time for others. We're a big group today. And just really appreciate you all doing a great job of offering those constructive comments and being considerate in your interactions. So please keep it up. Next slide, please. And then on stakeholder comments after meeting number 3. So we had 11 sets. They were posted all for you on the CETA website if you want to see individual comments. We've aggregated it up here to theme. First one, there is quite a bit on trade-off considerations. Questions of the generation mix, what stack of wind versus solar versus hydro, and what was the projected forecast for the generation additions. We had quite a bit on transmission cost impacts for renewable generation of, are you fully loading those renewable projects with transmission costs? Second theme from stakeholder comments was market integration. There's quite a bit from stakeholders about how and where and what type of technology to integrate to or to tie to SPP. Some questions on transmission solutions and requests from stakeholders needing more information of what are the cost assumptions, what are the underlying solutions, whether it's reconductoring or converting to a double circuit, just wanting more detail there. And advanced technologies, as Keegan referred earlier, there's a lot of questions of how are dynamic line ratings or GETs being considered, and Tom's going to address that here shortly. And then also feedback on the benefits evaluation and a suggestion of using FERC Order 1920, the 7 benefit categories to rank projects. And so, Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you here to talk through how the team responded.
No, thanks, Kathy. And as Keegan had mentioned before, we really appreciate all the feedback that we've received. We've been, doing our best to capture all of that feedback. We wish we could answer each one individually, but as the last couple of meetings, we've been trying to capture these more thematically and respond in that way. So just to hit a couple of these things, we've had some comments about the resource mix. And, if would that change the outcome, and if you change some of the types of resources and the locations. And I guess just a brief response to that is in general that the transmission is driven more by the size of the resource and where it's located. And you can change the type of it, but when you're looking at a planning world, it really has more to do with where that's located and the quantity of that resource. As far as in-state versus out-of-state, Keegan will talk a little bit more about, we did do an interstate analysis looking at some ties to other states, but unless you would really expand the scope of the work and start to look outside of the state as well, we really were focused just on the state of Colorado and understanding what the transmission plan or roadmap might be for that state. Now that plan, and we'll talk about that later, will enable, the ability to interact with the surrounding region and be able to transfer power back and forth. And we did observe some of that when we did that analysis. As far as the market integration, there was questions about the SPP. We did do a regional integration scenario, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, looking at how the system might be impacted if we were to receive some wind generation from SPP. And that's one of the key focuses that we did look at in that scenario, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There was a lot of input about transmission solutions and alternative technologies, and Keegan, I was going to give a spoiler alert. He's already kind of given that alert. Insofar as we did find some technologies that were really well applicable in terms of, for example, high capacity conductor. Some of the other advanced technologies, power flow controllers, using batteries, using dynamic line ratings, we just found those to be more applicable to near-term operational type solutions for the system. And we'll walk through some examples of that a little bit later. Some other ideas that came up across and some questions had to do with what we'll call co-locating, which is really rebuilding to double circuit. And we do find a lot of applications for that. And, we'll mention some of that as we go through the portfolio. So yeah, I was just looking through there, and I think that, as we still continue to appreciate the feedback, and we do have a location where we're trying to post all of that information in our responses. So feel free to go to that site. And if you continue to have questions, feel free to let us know.
Thank you, Tom. We're going to move on to the next slide. So, this is our agenda for the day. We'll move on to the congestion assessment results and findings, and I'll hand it back to the team.
Thanks, Kathy. That's me. So it'll take about 20 minutes, hopefully a little bit less to get through this to give the rest of the team a little time. Ben, that's right. You came to the right conclusion in the dialogue. I'm just trying to be a little less wonky and constantly saying congestion and using the word efficient, meaning i.e. lower cost, which is kind of mitigating the occurrence of congestion. So yes, you interpreted that right. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this production cost modeling exercise is the final step of the study. I know it gets a lot of attention. It's this really complex databases and complex modeling, expensive software, but it's a thing that comes last, and that's because there's good reasoning behind that from a planning philosophy. We really don't have much choice as to address the reliability and the deliverability needs of the system, right? So those really can't, we can't go without addressing those, literally from a NERC compliance standard, but also I think philosophically, that's an important, we got to round that base first, so to speak. The next base we hit is this congestion assessment, and that's, we take into account all those other upgrades first. So a lot of times we don't see a lot of issues when you look at it from that perspective. I'll go to the next slide here, and I'll kind of explain what we found. So this is the final analysis, basically just saying what I said. We performed the study. This is all focused on Colorado and Colorado's interties that connect to other states. And we're looking for congestion that, if addressed, could improve either in-state transfer of power or interchange between other states. The generation loads, everything's consistent with all the modeling we've done so far. So this isn't a new model. It's all entirely consistent down to the exact generation fleet. So that's why we're able to say some of the things we can say. It's all internally consistent. So once we identified some of those congested interface, we did a little power flow modeling to develop some solutions. We had a lot of data and expertise to draw on there from the work that Thomas mentioned a lot of. And we were able to kind of select additional upgrades and test them in the production cost model for their ability to mitigate that congestion. So one important concept is, do you want to address all congestion? No, that's probably not the case. There's an efficient frontier from this perspective, which is that some congestion on the system is probably good. It means you haven't gold-plated your transmission system, and you don't want to address it all because the cost of the transmission is likely more than the cost of the operational savings that you might realize, and other savings. But to the extent we do see severe congestion, there's a good story there, I think, in that one that does indicate, a pinch point in the grid, which generally isn't a good thing. And two, there's probably some other benefits that could be unlocked by addressing that. So we're looking for that severe congestion. So here's the details of what that analysis looks like on the next slide. So these are the detailed results. There's of course many more results than this, but this is what we're focused on. So first of all, and this is really not that important, but we did run a study that didn't have any of the transmission from the reference portfolio in it, just for, just to see. That's what's in that gray box. And we see really significant congestion in some areas that showed up in our reliability study. So not a lot of surprise there, just validated the work that we had already done to some extent. And And the way to read this table, the 3 columns on the left are congested hours. There's 760 hours in a year. This is, the number of hours that are congested. So you can work out the percentage pretty quickly in your head if you want to view it that way. And then the congestion cost, which is a representation of the really the difference in LMPs and the shadow price, which I'm not going to get into that on this call, but it's a metric for evaluating the economic severity of the congestion. So that's what congestion costs, and that's in thousands of dollars annually. Obviously we monitored many elements and paths. These are just those that we focused on here. So after we added the transmission, we have our reference case portfolio, and we had really 4 primary constraints within the state that had material congestion on them. Those are listed at the top there, and I've highlighted those issues in the red. So we had anywhere between $30 million to $77 million of congestion on those 4 elements. We weren't shocked to see these elements as being congestion, because we did see hints of issues on these even after our reliability upgrades. Some of them, like the Boone, Midway, and the Story Pawnee lines, sort of made sense to think about additional upgrades. We didn't see at base level really severe interstate congestion, other than on Tote 1A between Colorado and Utah. We observed roughly $40 million of annual congestion on that interface. And that was even after we built out these interstate upgrades. And I'll talk about the intrastate upgrades. I'll talk about the interstate analysis here momentarily. So this is some important results. If you go to the next slide, you can see the transmission we built out to address this. So this transmission totals, I think, roughly $55–60 million of additional investment. Really, relative to the rest of the cost of the portfolio, a fairly efficient expansion to address these remaining congestion. I think one of the fair arguments on the validity of this finding is that, well, today the system operates in large part on a contract path framework, which does, I think, in some cases, make a good point in the reliability of this type of study. How do you interpret this in a contract path world? In 2045, I think in large part, not many are expecting that that's going to be the operational dynamic of the grid. Our base assessment assumes a kind of a Colorado RTO into SPP West. I'll talk more about how sensitive those results are to different market assumptions later. But this is, I think, a fair characterization of how the system would dispatch and operate in the future, which is an organized market framework. And so there's, I think, a strong basis for addressing these congested elements that have pretty severe congestion costs. Go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about some of the other stuff. So we got a lot of interest in looking at some interstate upgrades. So we did see some congestion, and we also wanted to kind of offer up some additional interstate upgrades really for all the surrounding states. So we looked at 3 potential upgrades, really 4, but there's 3 directions they're going in. So the congestion on Tote 1A I mentioned was relieved with a 1200 MVA line from Craig to Coyote. So Coyote isn't a maybe a well-known substation, but this is a kind of an interim node on the currently under construction Gateway South transmission line that really is in that kind of northwestern Colorado. So this is a relatively small line, less than $200 million, about 40 miles from Craig to Coyote. That would greatly enhance the connectivity between the Colorado and really Utah / PacifiCorp transmission systems. There's a lot of complications with that connection that we won't get into here, other than that we did see that line be kind of heavily utilized, and it was effective at mitigating the congestion that we observed. If you look down here and these results, before we added this infrastructure, we had about $40 million of annual congestion costs between Colorado and Utah, and then those were mitigated down to, I think, $165,000 per year. So this line was effective at enabling economic interchange between those 2 areas. This is not to say there aren't other lines. There's likely many other lines, and there's probably many other ways to think about the business case, which I'll talk about later. We also looked at a connection south from Longhorn extension down to Gladstone in New Mexico. Some issues with this line is that outside of our scope was addressing New Mexico transmission planning. There are certainly some downstream constraints that would need to be addressed to make that a more efficient upgrade. We also developed Archer Alta Ranch 230 kV upgrade that really enhances tote 3 flows in and out of Wyoming. So all of these really improved interstate flows. And importantly, I think we got some concern like, hey, this study is focused on very much a lot of the in-state upgrades. I will say these projects don't really work in this time horizon if we have just in-state transmission constraints and congestion, right? So building out your seams and only your seams just leaves you with more deliverability issues within your state. So it was important to us that we shore up and understand and create a robust system in-state so that power can actually flow through Colorado, can flow between Colorado and its neighbors. And that's what these projects help to support. So go to the next slide. And I think I've got a map. Yep. So the pink lines are what we're talking about here. So the base portfolio is kind of baked in here. That's what the blue lines and the red lines, those are new lines. The blue lines are new 230 lines. We've got some reconductorings in there, and so that's the base portfolio. And then these pink lines are the lines that help to better interconnect Colorado to the rest of the Western system. Tom's study talks about how do we improve connections to SPP with the wind integration study. So this is just focused on the rest of the West. So you can see the details of these upgrades and what they look like. Yes, there's very many other options. We were very much focused on finding, I think, efficient upgrades. So we wanted to find things that we felt were relatively low cost, could be maybe pursued in a minimal risk manner, and are maybe within CETA's appetite in terms of coordination with neighboring states. So I'll go to the next slide now that you've got a sense of that, and just present some additional study results. So these are some additional dispatch modeling results. So what you see kind of moving left to right is us adding more transmission. So the general trend is that as we move from just the in-state reference portfolio upgrades and add some of these additional economic upgrades, we mitigate some of the solar curtailment we observed. The interstate projects help that further. Clean energy penetration is always going to move around a little bit. It's just so sensitive to what unit is dispatched where. But overall, the portfolio is hovering around 92% clean in Colorado around this time horizon. And all the transmission is affecting at pushing down CO2 emissions in the state. And importantly, we did see some material production cost benefits. So one of the things we observed, I think, was savings of about $16 million a year due to these interstate upgrades. So that's doesn't seem like a lot, but on a 40-year present value basis, I think that's around $300 million or so. So all kind of discounted back to present day dollars over a long time horizon. So that's a material operational savings, and that's not to say that's the only benefit of those types of upgrades. We'll explore some of those other benefits later in our study, and that'll be in the technical report. But we do think some of these interstate upgrades are showing some important efficiencies just from an operational standpoint, let alone from a load diversity sharing, a kind of resiliency risk mitigation perspective. There's a lot of other categories of benefits we'll explore. So that is it for the congestion study. I think I made that through in about 15 minutes. Kathy, is that right? How are we doing on time? Should I stop now and take any questions on that, or should we keep going?
I think we better keep going. The reference case, I think, is probably where we want to focus questions.
Right. Everybody's really focused on, I will stop using efficiency and just use the wonky terms of a J. But so when we say efficiency, we mean can we mitigate constraints that improve the operations? If you don't want me to use the word improve, what I mean is reduce the cost, right? So if we have congestion on the system, that causes you to dispatch generators that are higher cost than generators you would otherwise dispatch. So that's
Thank you.
efficiency, right?
Thank you.
So
That
that's
helps.
what
Yeah.
we mean. So it's very, kind of a technical thing. It's an LMP thing. It's a marginal heat rate thing. We want to use our most effective resources. It's a curtailment question as well. Sometimes we have energy that we could otherwise use that we don't because of transmission congestion. So efficiency just kind of captures all of those, right? Dispatching the most important generators, getting all the power to the grid that we can.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Just want to address that one's easy. So go ahead, Tom. I think you're next.
I think so. So
Cool.
if we go on a couple of slides. So we'll talk more about, where we are with our final portfolio. And in the last meeting, we talked about our reference studies, our 20-year analysis. If you go on to the next slide, it goes back to the flow chart that we'd been starting from. And at the last meeting, we're really just kind of focused on that orange box there. We're doing the power flow modeling, getting our 20-year models all established, looking at the reliability issues and coming up with solutions to those issues. And then as we've expanded to come up with what we call our final portfolio, we also took into account the production cost modeling that Keegan just talked about. We uncovered a few little projects based on that analysis. And then we also did some alternative analysis looking at the portfolio that we had and how looking at some potential alternatives might adjust our final portfolio. And also taking into account, stakeholder feedback to come up with that overall portfolio. So if you go on to the next slide, just as kind of a reminder where we came from, we started out adding a significant amount of resources into our 20-year horizon. And we showed these maps at the last stakeholder meeting to give you an idea of where the resources were located, the types of resources, basically in terms of wind, solar, gas, and battery, and kind of color coordinated those around the state. That top map on the right gives an idea of the magnitude and the location, and then the bottom map gives more of an idea of the quantity that we added into the system. As we talked about doing both a reliability type analysis and a deliverability type analysis, at that time we'd focused on deliverability by breaking the system into 9 zones and then looking at each of those zones individually, scheduling up the generation to high or maximum levels within each of those zones, scheduling it out of those zones and determining what the transmission issues were, and then coming up with solutions to those issues. And again, the idea, as Keegan mentioned, was to develop a transmission system that would be reliable for all types of conditions. And then we took that information and then we put it into more of a reliability type analysis, scheduling down the generation and then ensuring that the system was reliable from a more holistic statewide view. And so that's how we developed our original portfolio. And as going back to that last stakeholder meeting, we had our draft portfolio was near $4 billion. We had a lot of new projects and a lot of reconductor costs. So as I mentioned, when we were going into that and kind of digging deeper into our preliminary portfolio, we took some things into account. One was, are there any alternatives here that we might consider that might be a lower cost or more efficient type alternatives? Were there any feedback that we received from stakeholders that we might be able to consider? And were there any issues that arise from the congestion analysis in order to make any adjustments? Kind of the bottom line there is the final portfolio was really very similar in terms of cost to our original portfolio. It's a little bit higher cost, even though we did make some adjustments, but part of that has to do with refinement in our cost estimates. And Emily will talk some more about that. So we did utilize that more detailed cost assessment, taking into account all the different environmental and geographical and financial factors that Emily will list and how those weighed into the overall cost estimates. But you see, in the grand scheme of things, it's still around that $4 billion range. And that's broken into new projects, rebuilds, and reconductors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. If you go on to the next slide, this is a map of the final reference portfolio. And I didn't put in a comparison to the last because there's really not a lot of change as far as the what we're seeing here versus the last portfolio. But again, the blue lines are new 230 kV lines. The reddish lines are new 345. This map, I'm not showing the conceptual projects. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then we have a couple of areas where we've actually rebuilt some existing lines to double circuit. So this looks like there's not a lot, but this is just capturing the new projects, which there are about a dozen of those. What's not shown on this map are the number of reconductors that we did, because the map would completely be lit up with reconductors. If you move on to the next slide, just to talk a little bit more about some of the alternative analysis that we went through, and I've highlighted a couple of areas where we found some efficiencies. In the preliminary portfolio, we were looking at building a new Pawnee-Fort Lupton 230 kV line, really a second line in that same quarter, and also a new alt to Keota 345 kV line. I still think those are great projects and could actually be part of a portfolio in the future. But what we found when we were looking at alternatives is we found that if we did some reconductoring on some of the other local lines in the area, in this case, the Fort Lupton to JL Green line, we actually saw that the problems that we found that drove those new lines were mitigated. And so you see there was a difference in cost there of about 200 million just by reconductoring some existing lines rather than building those new lines. I did list here the St. Vrain to Windsor reconductor. That was one of the lines that came out of the congestion. The only other line that really of note that came out of the congestion analysis was a second Pawnee Story 230 kV line. And that's one that I think other planners have seen in historical planning, that there's a single tie between Pawnee and Story. It's a 230 kV line, and that just makes sense. It's a pretty short line, about 10 miles. And so that popped up in our analysis too, and we put that in our final portfolio. Going on to the next slide is another example of where we were looking at a line. This is in the northeast area of Colorado. It's a line between Ray and North Yuma. Originally, we looked at building a second line between those two buses, and we found that as going through some alternative analysis, if we just reconductored that existing line, some of those issues went away. Now, we did still need a new transmission line between, really North Yuma and up to Sydney, and between, Ray, North Yuma and over to Story. So those were key elements in the portfolio. That's an area of the system that is really mostly 230 kV, 115 kV. So once we started adding resources in that area, we saw a need for additional transmission. But you see there was another example of a savings of about $30 million just by going through that exercise. If you go into the next couple of slides, these slides are really tables that summarize the portfolio that we found. And as Keegan mentioned earlier, this is not the plan, it's a plan. It's a plan that we found that would help enable the resources that we modeled to be delivered to load. And these lists are broken into new projects, rebuilds, and reconductors. So I see here our new projects is only about a dozen projects, but they total, almost $3 billion. And some of these planners should be pretty familiar with in the state of Colorado, and they make sense. If you go on to the next slide, a couple of things I'd like to just talk about here is the magnitude. First of all, the first table are the rebuilds. And so these are taking existing lines, rebuilding those to double circuit. And so you see there's about a half a dozen of those. $200 million. But what I really want to key in on it is the reconductors. So if you look at the magnitude of the reconductors, this is where I feel that there's a lot of opportunity in going forward. Since we were taking, you know, a pretty quick look at the overall impacts of adding the resources needed in that 20-year horizon, and trying to come up with, you know, a good portfolio that would really enable the delivery of those resources. At the same time, we found that we really needed to beef up the existing system. And so you see here about, you know, almost 2,800 miles of reconductor, over $1 billion just in doing those reconductors. So I can see that this would be an area to focus on going forward in the future, is looking at opportunities here. There may be opportunities here to do additional rebuilds to double circuit, or to look for solutions for new build that might be able to alleviate some of these lines. But just wanted to point out that that is a significant portion of the portfolio, as it was with the preliminary portfolio. So I think I'll just go ahead and move on to and talk some more about the alternative analysis that we did. And these are just some examples of the projects that we looked at. We did, you know, we have that whole list of projects in our portfolio, and we did this type of analysis for every one of the projects. But I just wanted to, you know, give some ideas of, you know, the type of analysis that we did. And so if you look across the left, this is just a handful of the projects that we looked at. And the first two are the examples that I gave when we went through our alternative analysis and actually came up with some different solutions. But as you go across the columns to the right, these are the types of alternatives that we evaluated. So the first column is the project. The second column is a potential alternative that we thought about, but we also thought about these other alternatives. So as you go across, you know, is it a candidate for either a reconductor or using a, you know, a higher rated conductor, an advanced type conductor that, you know, has the potential for a higher rating? Is this a project that, you know, there may be an opportunity to rebuild it to double circuit? And we use this term co-locate. And when we use that, that really means taking an existing line, rebuilding that line to double circuit. So not only do you have the existing circuit, perhaps at a higher rating, but also you've really doubled the transmission on those towers. And I think in Colorado, there's a really good opportunity for that co-location, rebuilding to double circuit versus building a new line in the same corridor. Even though there's some reliability benefits, the corridors are pretty tight. Going across, we get into more of the advanced technologies. You know, is there an opportunity to use storage to maybe mitigate some of the transmission issues we found? What about advanced power flow, dynamic line ratings? So you see, we did evaluate all those. And, you know, as far as those go, as Keegan mentioned, some of those technologies are great for the operational world, for operating the system to mitigate short-term loading issues. When you think about the planning world, where you're looking out 10 to 20 years and trying to get an understanding of how to develop a reliable system that will operate under all conditions, they just aren't as applicable today. Now, does that mean they won't be applicable later as the technologies develop? I think that we're going to start to see some of those. And, you know, I encourage utilities and others to continue to evaluate these types of technologies. There was a comment in the chat about batteries, and I agree. I think there's going to be some application for batteries and where you locate those in order to be able to move some power around, to be able to mitigate some of the loading issues. But again, those are, you know, it kind of depends on the availability of those sources and when you're able to use those, and are they really going to be able to be used under all conditions in the future? That could very likely be so. Going back to the first two examples, here are the examples that I had already talked about in earlier slides. Fort Lupton to Pawnee and Alt Keota, those were projects that were recommended in the preliminary portfolio. The potential project alternative was to reconductor a line, and in that case, the Fort Lupton Jail Green 230 kV line. I put that in green because that was actually a viable solution that we went forward with and put into our final portfolio. As you go across, the green is like, yes, are these applicable? Red, not so much. But could you reconductor and use advanced conductor? As you go through, I think, you know, advanced conductor is going to be a good solution in a lot of cases. As the costs come down, I think it's going to be very applicable, especially for new lines. And as you think about needing to reconductor lines, use those advanced conductors, especially if you are not able to, don't have the corridor to rebuild new towers and have new right-of-way, and as far as costs go as well. The next column, as far as rebuilding to double circuit / co-locating, I always think that's a good idea whenever you can do it. At least get the right-of-way to be able to, in the future, make sure you have the room there to be able to build double circuit. Even if you build double circuit capable right away, I think that's always a good idea for the future. So you see a lot of that is in green. Some of those blues, I put that in there as maybe. So for example, if you go on down to the third one, Smoky Hill Missile Site, Pronghorn, reconductoring that one just didn't really work, but could you reconductor that using advanced conductor? I think that's good. It's not a solution for the, you know, for this particular project, but anytime you touch a project, adding that advanced conductor is a good idea if it's cost effective. So that just kind of gives an example of how, a few examples of how we looked at each of the projects and then all the different alternatives. We didn't have the time to go completely in depth on every one of these, but we did go ahead and take a cursory look at this. So we have a complete table of this for all of our projects. I just wanted to give, you know, the stakeholders an idea of the thought process that we went through as we were evaluating alternatives. If you go on to the next slide, I mentioned that we adjusted our costs from the preliminary portfolio based on the detailed analysis that Emily and the Montera group did in really digging into all of these different types of issues associated with routing, and then coming up with specific routing based on these factors and applying some multipliers to those to come up with final costs. So I'll just maybe stop right there. And we've got a few slides here for Emily to kind of walk through the process that she used for the routing and the cost estimates, which is really pretty fascinating. So I'll turn it over to you, Emily.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tom. So the methodology that we used to do the transmission routing is based on a paper published by EPRI and Georgia Tech in 2006. It's called the EPRI GTC Overhead Electric Transmission Line Siting Methodology. And with this method, we apply GIS-based least cost path analysis. We specify the endpoints of a given line, and we use a cost surface to characterize the terrain. And in the illustration on the right, you can see that the lighter color areas are this is an illustration of the slope layer. The lighter colored areas have lower cost, essentially the base cost that you would see in the MISO cost guide. The darker areas are hilly and mountainous terrain, and they have higher cost according to the multiplier for that layer. We combine this slope layer with other layers to account for forests, rivers, lakes, urban areas, and other factors which can bring increased costs. And with these inputs specified, the least cost path model identifies the path, the route, the detailed route from point to point, avoiding essentially the darker areas on the map. You can go to the next slide. So we ran the least cost path model for about 150 lines identified by Energy Strategies. The lines range from a few miles to 160 miles in length. The estimated cost ranges from about $400,000 per mile to $8 million per mile, depending on the technology and the terrain. In some mountainous locations, the total line cost may be up to 2 times the base cost that you would get from the simple MISO per unit cost guide assumptions. For lines that are specified to be new greenfield corridors, we estimate the location-specific right-of-way land cost for the corridor in addition to the line cost. The land cost tends to be about 1 to 5% of the total cost. It is higher in more densely populated areas. And for locations where we're citing an additional line co-located in an existing corridor, the land cost for right-of-way expansion is estimated at 30% of the new greenfield of what it would be for a new greenfield corridor. So here you see the portfolios visualized. The 20-year final transmission portfolio is shown in red. To the right of that, we have the conceptual projects overlaid in dashed yellow lines. Then the high demand scenario, the interstate scenario, the regional integration scenario in the lower row. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see the areas where these lines cross high wildfire risk areas. The high wildfire risk areas are shown in red. And for the final portfolio, as well as the high demand regional integration and interstate portfolio, there are just a couple of locations that are common across portfolios where we're seeing high wildfire risk. Then there are a few additional locations of high wildfire risk for the conceptual projects, mostly in Western Colorado. I'm not sure if I said this already, that the definition of high wildfire risk is based on USDA and Forest Service data. We take the top quartile of risks to structures from the information that they've published. Then let's go to the next slide. This is a summary of the terrain types that are affected by each portfolio. So after the path and corridor footprints have been identified, then we can look at what the underlying terrain types are. The majority of the affected area is hay, pasture, shrub, and grassland and agricultural land. We do have a small fraction of the total area occurring on federal land. There are a few line segments occurring in developed areas, which do have higher cost. Then across the portfolios, there are 40 to 50 river crossings and 35 to 40 road crossings. And wildfire risk areas tend to be on the order of 5% of the total area affected. That's the same is true for mountainous terrain. It tends to be about 5% of the total area affected. And for some of these terrain types, the greatest amount of federal land is in conceptual projects. And you can see that, which colored bar is greatest, just listed in bullets here. Greatest cultivated cropland is in the SPP wind portfolio. I believe that's another name for the either the interstate portfolio or interregional. The greatest developed areas are affected in the high demand portfolio, and the greatest forest is in conceptual projects. Greatest fire is in conceptual projects. That's it for the land use analysis and least cost path analysis. Who should I be passing the torch to for the next slide?
Thanks. Thanks, Emily. What was good to see is that, this was a great exercise, and it really gets into the details and really an understanding of the types of terrain and taking into account wildfire risk, mountainous terrain, rivers, and those types of things. What was, I guess, encouraging on our side is that we didn't see a huge difference in our preliminary costs, but and in some cases we did see variations because we don't always consider all those various factors. And so we really do have an appreciation for our cost estimates based on the work that Emily has done. Just if you move on to the next slide, it's the final slide here for the portfolio. And just to let everybody know, we didn't forget about the conceptual projects. We just didn't want to talk about those too much. Those really didn't change any from the preliminary portfolio, but we still have this, list of conceptual projects or alternative projects in addition to what we call our portfolio. And to me, this provides kind of the entire picture of the roadmap, because depending on the magnitude of resources and where they're located, some of these alternatives, conceptual projects could easily come into play. And as I'll talk about here in a few minutes, we actually did see the need for some of these as we moved into some of the scenario analyses. So we just wanted to make sure that we let everybody know that we have not lost these projects. We just didn't do a lot more analysis on those. It's somewhat difficult to see, but one of the larger ones is a 345 kV backbone along the western slope of Colorado, and then building in from that western slope to the Front Range through that existing corridor, kind of the Montrose, Curcani, Poncha to Midway, since that's an existing corridor. I know one of our stakeholder comments that I don't think I hit on earlier talked about building across from west to east, and so that is part of the conceptual plan, is to build on that kind of south central corridor to get across. As most people in Colorado know, building across the Continental Divide is a pretty monumental task. So existing corridors, being able to utilize those where possible, will be the best alternative. So I guess I'll pause there. That's kind of the end of summarizing the final portfolio. I don't know, Kathy, I did see a couple of questions pop up. Some of those are pretty easy as far as the color coding on that alternative. I tried to do like a green, yes, this was good. Blue, that's a maybe, there's potential there. Red was not so viable. So that was at least my thought process behind that. I saw somebody made a comment about Alt Husky already being built double circuit. And if that's the case, we did have a cost in there for rebuilding that. So if it's already built for double circuit and you just have to string the other side, that just brings that cost down even more. The point was just we saw the need for having that extra circuit there, so our cost might be a little bit off. The other question about the Colorado microgrid, I guess I'm just not as familiar with, I'm not familiar at all with what that question is, the Colorado microgrid roadmap findings. Maybe if somebody else on our team knows what that is, but we'd be happy to look into that.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think why don't we pause here? That's a lot of material, and I think the reference case is really the heart of the work. So maybe pause here, and it sounds like I think we've addressed most of the questions in the chat, but if folks want to weigh in here, raise your hand and we'll go ahead and hear your thoughts. Dan?
Yeah, since we're looking at this slide, it's difficult to see exactly at this scale, but I think I'm seeing conceptual projects that roughly follow most of the path of the Colorado Power Pathway. I just wanted to see if that's accurate and wonder if you could explain that.
Yeah, and so some of that had to do with working through the alternatives, working through the paths, and really these are not meant to be shown as a whole, but particular segments. So depending on where you locate resources, if you put a lot of resources out east around the Burlington area, around the Lamar area, we did see a need for additional transmission, even in parallel with the CPP. The potential for building up that existing 230 kV line between Burlington and Lamar, that maybe there's an opportunity there that could be double circuit 230 to even beef up that area of the state even more. Some of the other pieces that you see in parallel are, for example, between Lamar and Boone and Comanche, there's some underlying 230 kV system that even if you have the Colorado Power Pathway there's still chances that those lines can exhibit unacceptable loading. And so what we found is we didn't need to do that as long as we tied in the pathway with the existing system. But we did see that as we're looking at some sensitivities with even higher generation out there. And as you'll see with the SPP wind getting injected into Lamar and Burlington, we found that there may be instances where you need to do some additional transmission along those corridors.
Interesting. Great. Well, while my camera's on and my mic is live, I just wanted also, I noticed in an earlier slide, the statement that demand response will only postpone the need for transmission, additional transmission resource. Tom, I don't know if you're the right person to talk to that or not, but I just wanted to ask you for a little bit more description of that. Because I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the load that will be added will be controllable load, not obviously not heating, but other new anticipated loads will be controllable. So wanted to check in, see if you have any more support for that.
So, I mean, again, I think that that's another subject that's ripe for further evaluation, and you have time to look at that. We're looking at this 20-year time frame. I guess in my experience, what we've seen with that demand response is that it really just shaves off the peak. And so it has an opportunity to just reduce that. Now, I think the comment that I saw in there is it just postpones the need for transmission. And so if you're thinking that transmission is going to continue to develop, load and demand is going to continue to develop, and it just, shaves that slope, eventually you're going to need to get there. So what we've tried to do is just develop that roadmap, the potential as you go along the way, and you're finding that those distributed resources are actually doing that. And if the future is, as you say, is you're able to control those loads, that's great. You have the opportunity to look at that. But again, this is a roadmap for that future. And I agree that if your load continues to grow, especially if you're thinking about high demand and high electrification, it's just going to eventually end up in the same place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go on to Larry, please.
Sorry, it took me a minute to get the buttons right. So I made the comment about storage in the chat, and I won't repeat that, but the response I heard was that this large-scale use of storage might be a good idea in the future. However, I'd note that this whole exercise is about needs 10 to 20 years in the future. So I guess I would double down on the relevance of considering storage at the gigawatt hour scale across the system as a way of doubling the utility of the existing transmission system and greatly increasing interconnection of resources.
I can handle that, Larry. So one of the things that we have to look at in that is the actual technical needs of the system, and looking at storage as a transmission solution. And we have done and designed storage as a transmission solution upgrades. So we're quite familiar with kind of how to think about that. One of the challenges that we saw in developing this system goes to the severity of the overloads I mentioned. So for example, one of the things that we would see is, for example, a line that would be overloaded by, say, 80% of its emergency rating, or 100% or 50%, right? So there's a very significant demand for flow across that system. It's technically true, right? That you can put, let's say that flow is 600 megawatts of additional flow we need. And you want to put a storage device on the upstream end of that, and you want it to operate in charge mode during that condition to mitigate that contingency. That storage device might be approaching a gigawatt in terms of its capacity. And when we look at the efficiency of the investments, a gigawatt of storage relative to a relatively minor reconductoring project that can provide that incremental capacity, the economics aren't really there at this scale. What we really want to hammer home is storage as a transmission solution is a very effective short term. We've seen it used primarily as a short term solution. So I'll correct a little bit of maybe Tom's view in that if we see an evolving issue in say the 5-year horizon, and we don't think we can get transmission built in that time, and you can deploy a storage asset in 24 months, and you can operate it with a specific operational paradigm and constraint, that's an effective way to mitigate short-term reliability issues, but it does not increase the robustness of your grid. And one of the things that's important about grids is they need to be able to deliver resources in times of system need. And this points to resource adequacy. So that storage device cannot play a resource adequacy role if it's sitting there for the purposes of acting as a transmission asset. So it's a singular, purpose-built investment upwards of 1 gigawatt. And that can be at a very expensive proposition where what we saw a lot in Colorado is we really need to move resources across the system when the loads demand their power. And we just didn't see that as a technically viable alternative in the long term, right? This 20-year future. So I hope you can follow some of that reasoning, Larry, but there's a technical foundation behind it. Very much we found storage as transmission asset solutions in the CAISO region and developed them and proposed them with our clients, and a lot of times they make sense, but those are typically sort of near-term operational issues, which is like, hey, we can't get this line permitted, or we can't do this thing, we have this 5-year need, what are our options, right? And that's where that comes into play. Does that make sense? Anything else on that?
Yeah, it does. I thank you for that. I guess I'm also just not necessarily thinking about what are the capabilities today, but what will be the capabilities 5-10 years in the future when storage is really quite a lot cheaper, and so it would make a lot more economic sense. And also if it's deployed not just on a single line for a single project, but more system wide, that could help out in moving large power. But
makes sense, and that's probably what Tom was speaking to, and he meant the future developments would be the cost effectiveness equation that I mentioned will likely change over time. So that's I think where the subject to reevaluation comment came in. But for example, just to take it to the logical extreme, we have a lot of resources on the east side of the system. If you paired just tons of storage so that when we had a transmission outage, we can just soak up that output and not have any transmission violations. What happens when we need to get those resources into the Denver metro area to serve peak demand? Right? That's one of the key problems that we saw with solutions like that were sort of, like I said, operational fixes, but this concept of deliverability and resource adequacy really reared its head in this study. So
just one quick final comment on that. I think the idea would be you also have perhaps an equivalently sized battery on the Denver metro side. And so that power would be transmitted from where it's generated to the Denver metro area during most of the time when the line loading is really quite low. And then it would be there in the Denver metro area to serve the load when load arises.
Appreciate that. I appreciate the vision, Larry. So Kathy, maybe we can go on to somebody else there.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I see 2 hands up, and then I do want to address a couple comments in the chat, and then let's keep going so we make sure we get to the rest of the presentation. Tyler, and then I'm going to go on to Chris.
Great, thanks, Kathy. First of all, thanks for including the interstate projects. I think we're really excited to see them kind of be implemented as solutions. My question is going to be around the economic congestion analysis, Keegan. So hope this question makes sense, but I recognize that you're not focusing on states outside of Colorado, but what assumptions are you making when you're evaluating the economic congestions for states, like generation assumptions for states like New Mexico, Utah?
Yeah, we can. So if you reference, I think we didn't talk a lot about that today, Tyler, just because obviously I have 45 minutes left, but there is in stakeholder meeting 3, we summarize, we built the data set around the
WEC ADS, maybe?
It started with the WEC ADS, but we built it out to 2045, consistent with one of the NREL futures scenarios. I can't remember which one. It's escaping me, and the details I'm holding in my head, but reference that and then follow up with me. It does reflect, some expansion across the rest of the West, We did not focus on the transmission systems in those areas because they just kind of complicated the modeling, but we did get load forecasts and generation forecasts for a 25 future updated, in parallel to Colorado. So we had a reasonable representation of interchange opportunities at the state.
That's great, and appreciate the answer. That aligns with kind of what we were expecting, just pushing the boundary on those assumptions and making sure that we're kind of looking at a future of the West that aligns with some of those state goals. So thanks. I'll pass it off to the next commenter. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler. Chris?
Yeah, this is just for the report itself. Keegan kind of mentioned it in the chat recently about the Gladstone area. I just want people to be aware that getting to Gladstone is only half the battle, half the marathon, if you will. Getting out of Gladstone, especially New Mexico, is also quite difficult, and it's going to be quite expensive. There's a couple of reports on Tri-State's Oasis. One of them was an informational study done in 2022. I think it's Stargazer is what they call it. But we looked at adding a bunch of generation in the Gladstone area, and it was just like a $2 billion transmission project to make the thing even work. But I want to make sure that's in the report, like a caveat, that Gladstone is not the final solution to building. Like, you get to Gladstone, you're like, cool, that's half the problem. And just make sure people are aware of that, because I don't want people to think, oh, just build and we're done.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, Chris, and we'll get that captured. That's actually one of the things we struggled with the interstate analysis, is we think there's things like, for our connection into Gateway South, there's complications with that would need to be addressed. There's downstream constraints in New Mexico. I think Tote 3 would be the one that I would say Colorado is, maybe has the most enterprise on to kind of do things autonomously. That would need maybe less upstream upgrades, but we'll talk about that. I do have some findings on that about, next thoughts on next steps in that area.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
Chris.
agree. These are great ideas. It's just like, if you're only looking at Colorado, but when you think about, like Ryan said, you get to Gladstone, if there's not the same type of vision and build out in the 20-year future for New Mexico, you just run into roadblocks there.
Thank you. All right, I think we've addressed all the hands raised, and from what I'm monitoring in the chat, I think the team has addressed most of it. John Parks, thank you for putting in on the microgrid and the link there to respond to Jim. And I think, why don't we move on to the next part of the agenda, the scenario results and findings, please. So Matt, if you want to advance.
Sure. So we looked at 2 scenarios, and this is where things really got challenging. So if you go on to the next slide, you think about building a 20-year model with, over 10 gigawatts of new resources in there. I think we had around 14. And, all of the issues associated with that and the transmission limitations just associated with that. And then one of the things that we agreed to do was look at a scenario that was even higher demand. So we call this our high demand scenario. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like, on top of the resources and the load increase that we added for a 20-year scenario, we put in, roughly another 7 gigawatts of load and resources to go along with that load on top of what we already had in the 20-year scenario. And the idea behind this, of course, was to, if you think about a future where you have a higher demand growth, is the portfolio that we thought about for the reference case, is it adequate? Is it not adequate? What kind of things need to be done to that? So again, our incremental case had close to 14 gigawatts of addition, and then we added a 7 on top of that. So, a 50% increase on top of that. The couple of maps here just give you an indication of where we located those resources incremental to the reference case. So the one there on the right with the colors just really gives an idea. So we added, in the neighborhood of 1,100 megawatts of solar, 1,100 megawatts of battery storage, and 5,000 megawatts of firm or gas resources. And the logic we used, for the battery, it was kind of where we had existing solar locations. For the gas, it was where we had already located some gas. For the reference case, just bumping that up even farther. We didn't play too much with those locations, but this is what we landed on. And then, for the solar, we did, use some of the bus bar mapping to kind of spread out where that additional solar would go. So again, the idea was to do both a reliability and a deliverability analysis. And in this case, we didn't have any changes to some of the areas. So instead of looking at all 8 zones, I think we looked at 6. But the challenge was to get there to begin with. So I think if you move to the next slide, just to give you an idea of trying to develop this case, we had significant issues just trying to get the case to what we call solve or converge or even be able to work because of the extreme lack of transmission between the reference case and this now high demand case. And so we had to do a lot of massaging to the case, work on the transmission that was already there before we could even get to a place where we could try to think about the deliverability of the case. So just to give you an idea of the type of and the magnitude of the issues that we had, if you look at the overall kind of summary there, the total incremental cost was really another $4 billion. And this is on top of the $4 billion in transmission build out that we did for the reference case. So we essentially doubled the build out. And to get there, that first tranche is just to get the case to be able to use the case. And so if you can kind of go through that list of the rows there where it just says base, all of the things we had to do. And so there, we had to reconductor 115, 138, 230 kV lines, 1,100 plus miles of those lines just to get there. We also had to add a bunch of transformation to the case. We had to add a lot of new 115 kV lines, and we did a lot of rebuilds on existing 115 and 230 kV lines. In addition to that, we turned on the conceptual projects on the Western Slope so that Craig, Montrose, Four Corners, and then the line that goes across from west to east, we turned on those on because we did add significant generation around the Craig area. So this was just to get to the place where we could actually then look at deliverability issues as well. So just to put it in perspective, just to get the case to work, $3.8 billion. Then looking at the deliverability issues, not in the grand scheme of things, not as much, still $450 million, but nothing compared to just getting the case to work. So overall, the last half of that table, you can get an idea of the types of rebuilds and some I think mostly rebuilds and some reconductors. So not a lot beyond what we'd already done just to get the case to work. But I guess the punchline for this high demand scenario is it really did double the build out that we needed for the reference case. So if you do believe that, this is the type of future that we're going to see load growth well beyond what we modeled before, which was around 2% per year, this is a pretty drastic increase, but it was what our group gave us in terms of projection. So all of that information that we put into that original portfolio, really you're going to start to think about having to utilize the toolbox for those conceptual projects, especially on the Western Slope, and even more and faster improvements to the existing transmission system. And again, as I'll point out, like I did with the portfolio, this whole list of the reconductors, I think that's ripe for additional study and really getting an understanding. We didn't have the luxury to really go through every one of those and determine what the most efficient solution might be. But for many of these, I think there's an opportunity for looking at existing lines, rebuilding them to double circuit, perhaps coming up with looking at what the contingencies were, what were the issues that caused these to be problems to begin with, and maybe beefing up other parts of the system that may be able to alleviate many of these reconductors by fixing another line somewhere else. But this was really just to try to get an idea of the order of magnitude and whether or not, you know, the reference portfolio would even come close. And in this case, it really didn't. So I think that's all I'll say about the high demand. Other than it was a great challenge, and I think this is a good opportunity to continue to look at, you know, what does the future look like in terms of load growth, and what are those projections really going to be, and doing studies that utilities do and others do, and understanding what the transmission needs are. The other scenario that we took a look at was what we call regional integration, and in this case was looking at how would the system be impacted if we were to inject wind from the eastern side of the system into the Colorado system? Does the portfolio that we came up with, is that adequate? Would it need to be improved? And so if you go on to the next slide, just to give you an idea of what we looked at, and this was injecting wind to the seam along the eastern edge. And this is where we have existing back-to-back DC ties because we're asynchronous with the east, or we thought there might be a potential for having an additional DC tie. So we looked at 3 locations. We looked at starting with Lamar and then Burlington and Sydney. And we looked at 2 gigawatts of wind coming from that eastern side, getting injected into the system. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at this. And so one way is just to assume that all of our resources are coming from SPP. You don't have any of those resources, they all get displaced in Colorado. If that's the study you do, it really doesn't show much. The other thing you could do is assume that all of the resources in Colorado in the east are on in addition to all these resources coming from SPP. In that case, you've got a huge amount of resources that you don't really need. We chose a path that was in between those two, and showing a moderate level of resources remaining in Colorado, but still showing that higher level of generation getting penetrated into the eastern side. We did 3 alternatives of this scenario. One was injecting all 2 gigawatts into the Lamar area. One was injecting 1 gigawatt into Lamar and 1 gigawatt into Burlington. And the last was 1 gigawatt into Lamar and 1 into Sydney. Again, there's a whole variety of ways that we could have looked at that. We chose Lamar was kind of the standard there because that seemed like a likely place to be able to inject coming from that SPP side. The last thing I want to say is that we did not evaluate the cost of implementing additional DC ties or higher rated DC ties in order to make this happen. So that's a whole technological question that we just didn't go to. To put it in perspective, the ties that already exist are in the 200 megawatt range. And here we're thinking about, 2 gigawatts coming across there. So really a huge endeavor just to think about how this might occur. The next slide really gives a summary of the results for each of those scenarios. And since we did inject at Lamar every time, we found that there were some needs around that area, no matter which of the alternatives we chose. And the first 3 rows really point out that there are some needs around the Lamar area. And since we didn't really do anything with the tie, what this really indicates is that you'd need to beef up the tie between the Colorado Power Pathway and the existing system. We modeled, one line there in our portfolio, but you'd need to really beef that up. And you'd also have to beef up that existing 230 kV system to the west of Lamar, which is not surprising when you're sending that much power in there. Even with the power pathway being there, we still saw this. And I think I, mentioned that earlier, that there may be instances where you still need additional transmission above and beyond the pathway. Going on down into the next set really just gives an idea of if you put all 2 gigawatts into Lamar, you see the bottom line there is around 160 million of upgrades. If you did some at Lamar and some at Burlington, that's where we saw the need for additional transmission out of Burlington. So that one was really double the cost of the one just going into Lamar, and one at Lamar and one at Sydney. The one where we did a gigawatt at Lamar and a gigawatt at Sydney, again, under 200 million. But, again, that showed that the overall portfolio was relatively adequate. And again, it depends on the assumptions that you make on how much would get transferred across there and what the existing or planned generation would be on that eastern slide. But this, gives an idea of the magnitude of impact that you would have by trying to make that transfer from SPP. One more time, we didn't consider any of the costs that might be associated with upgrading the ties or what technology you might take to get there. We decided to do the input at the seams. I know we did get a stakeholder comment suggesting that we send that power straight into the metro area or closer to the metro area. It just made more sense to do it on the seams because there's already transmission build out there, and it's easier to build out the transmission that's already there rather than try to deliver it somewhere else. So those are the two scenarios, pretty exciting scenarios. Not surprising, some of the results that we received, and I don't have a lot of the maps of how those transmission elements would show on the map, but we'll have that in the final report. So I think that's all I have in terms of talking about the scenario analysis that we did.
Yeah, I'll just add, Tom. I think there was a study at CCPG on the technical feasibility of expanding the DC ties. I think that was wrapped up earlier this year. The DC tie expansion task force at Tri-State did a lot of that work, so we didn't try to redo that. But I can't remember if there's any cost in that, cost estimates in that work. That notwithstanding, one of the reasons we didn't do that was we kind of didn't want to say that was the only option to access SPP resources, right? They could come through upgraded DC ties, but they could come through new DC lines, new converter stations, new infrastructure that would otherwise get those resources somewhere into Eastern Colorado. And so this gives you a sense of the downstream effects of that.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest we keep going here and finish the last section, the methodology updates and ongoing work, and then open to questions.
That's great. I might even, Kathy, ask that we just go through the final section, just so I really want to have time to go through that, and then take questions at the end, if that's okay. That sounds great. Thank you. I just don't want to rush through the findings. It always seems to happen. So jump in here to the next slide. So I'm just going to give a quick update. We've got a few loops to close. One, we're getting some good feedback in the chat channel. So thanks for that. We'll obviously be looking at that. Go to the next slide. But here's the other update. So we do have a final component of our scenario analyses left. Pretty much, everything is captured in the regional integration work, everything we've been talking about so far, but there's some other studies we need to close out and document, which will be in the final technical report. So we have agreed upon assumptions. We got some really good stakeholder feedback after the last meeting on this extreme event assessment. Well, really, all that we're doing here is we built out a lot of transmission. We're just assessing that transmission system ability to respond under these conditions. Those studies are underway still. We didn't get them completed by this meeting. The other area that we didn't talk about today, in large part just due to a lack of time, is that we did do some sensitivity on the market expansion constructs that we assumed. So we looked at Colorado RTO with other parallel markets in the rest of the West. We look at a West-wide RTO, and really what we found is that the underlying dispatch and the physics causing the congestion issues that we see, didn't really change that much. the changes were marginal. It really didn't cause us to change any of our conclusions. We'll provide fuller documentation of that in the technical report. I just couldn't walk through everything today, but it was a relatively simple takeaway. We were asked to look at that, and so that it was pretty clear that the market expansion assumptions didn't really impact the congestion findings significantly. We have a value proposition underway. This is a list of the benefits we're capturing for the transmission portfolio. The idea here is kind of we've arrived at the portfolio that we need for our given scenario, the reference case, and then we're kind of going to backtrack and then assess the benefits from a number of different metrics. And then finally, we've been asked to compile a list of future study areas. So obviously one that keeps coming up is how does Colorado pursue one or more of these interstate projects? That's on the list. What would need to be done in terms of coordination there. We have a number of other findings and recommendations. Obviously, this study was to some extent expedited. We would have liked to have the time to look at more scenarios and more sensitivities, play around with resource siting to a larger extent, move it around the system. There's a lot of things we would have liked to have been able to do. So this inaugural study didn't capture everything. So we're developing a list of areas to consider for future study work. And then in additional, we're working on that initial report, which is due at the end of September, or sorry, at the beginning of September. Go to the next slide, and I think that's it for this section. And I'm just going to jump into a couple things to close us out here, and then we can have some dialogue the last 20 minutes or so. The next slide, Kathy. So within the work plan, we have this gap analysis. So the purpose of the gap analysis is to look at these portfolios of upgrades we identify and determine if any of these needs are addressed by a conceptual project previously proposed, or if that they're kind of new novel needs. So we're trying to do is inform CETA so that they can consider this information and identifying, prioritizing, supporting project partnerships and opportunities. So there's going to be more detail. We can go through project by project, but you don't really need to because it's fairly simple analysis. So the reference case portfolio, that portfolio represents about $4.2 billion of investment. About 30% of that is reconductoring upgrades, which we don't really see as a true gap from our gap analysis. Those can happen through the course of normal planning. Utilities already have right of way for those. If you develop a planning requirement that causes an issue, that's a pretty clear way to mitigate it. So we wouldn't say that needs that would represent a gap that needs to be filled. Those are things that utilities in the state have capability of addressing. I would be more concerned with, from a gap perspective, the other 70% of transmission investment, the greenfield upgrades. Those might need some coordination among multiple parties, might need procurement of new right-of-way. Now that's not in terms of line miles, they're actually less line miles than 70%, but in terms of total investment, that's what that represents. And so that's a gap we've identified that will make clear to CETA. I think for the most part, all of the conceptual projects, we're not aware of any planned upgrades on track to do those exact things. However, we're not really considering those a planning gap either, because as Tom described, those are kind of either or upgrades. That wouldn't be implemented as an entire portfolio, one, and two, you may not need all those projects at once. You might just respond to the needs of the system. So we're not really characterizing that as a gap as well. The interstate projects, we don't think any of these concepts are entirely new, but we're not aware that any of these are being actively developed, at least by Colorado entities. There are some interstate kind of independent developer proposals that would accomplish some of these similar objectives, but are they the exact same that we identified? Likely not. So we do recognize that there's other solutions that may fill this need. However, we will ultimately point out to CETA that those that we arrived at that appear to be fairly efficient, we don't see as being pursued at this exact moment, but could be explored by the state. And then finally, as scenario projects, again, because they're scenarios, we likely won't characterize them as a gap, but should that future unfold, especially the high demand scenario, as Tom made it clear, you basically need to double your 20-year transmission build. So there's a significant transmission need into that future. Go to the next study, or next slide, please. So this is the initial findings we have. I'll try to run through these briefly. So the 10-year horizon, to some extent, confirmed what's been lingering in other planning processes, just maybe pulled it all together into one place. So we found that, we do have transmission needs in the San Luis Valley, Northeast Colorado, and the Southeast areas, right? So, but the one thing we saw is that these needs are exacerbated in the 20-year time frame. So project solutions in this area are ripe for right sizing, right? So CETA should consider this in evaluating, how they participate in these engagements, right? So the idea is to make an investment perhaps that's scalable for the long-term needs of the system. And these areas do seem to have needs that are not only needed in the 10-year time frame, but also in the 20-year time frame. Aside from those areas and the Denver Metro, which we sort of assumed out of our study, we understand those will be addressed. The rest of the system appears to be sufficient in terms of transmission plans to meet the resource and load trajectories from the Colorado ERPs. So looking out a little further, moving beyond 2035 to 2045, we identified a need for additional 10 gigawatt of renewable resources, 2 gigawatts of storage, and 3 gigawatts of additional firm. So that's in and above and beyond the additional 8 gigawatts that are being added now to 2035. So we feel good about what's happening between now and 2035, but this additional 15 gigawatts of resources does create challenges for the transmission system. So what do those challenges look like? To us, based off what we see in this portfolio, this roadmap, we see a need for about $4.2 billion of additional capital investment in the transmission. That's addressing, about 3,700 line miles. Those are not all new lines, of course, but this system will meet the reliability and deliverability needs for the future that we modeled. And there's, going to be some ability to operate that system efficiently as well. So avoid, really severe congestion getting those resources to loads. Greenfield projects make up a minority of that, which is good news in terms of feasibility. Of the 3,700 miles, I mean, almost 3,000 of them are reconductoring lines. So the total line miles of new build, is around 750 miles, which we think in the 20-year time frame is a manageable development goal. Go to the next slide. Conclusion finding four, or initial finding four, is that there's some significant development gaps, as I just mentioned. CETA could have a role in filling those, facilitating expansion of the systems to help meet these needs efficiently. What do I mean by efficiently in this context? I mean, it doesn't make sense to build a line for a 10-year need and reconductor it, 5 years later, right? So CETA, with this vision, we hope can interact with other Colorado stakeholders intelligently and provide a roadmap view of what might be best for the state. I just covered a lot of this when I was covering the gap, so this is a roll up of everything I just mentioned on the last slide. So I'll skip the rest of this. We did, from our study results, see the opportunity to enhance planning coordination in Colorado. So there's some major projects. The Colorado Power Pathway is one. Anything that happens in the San Luis Valley, and some of these reconductoring solutions. So what we envision here is a need for continued collaboration among Colorado utilities, interconnecting and creating new interties between some of these projects and these systems. From our view, which is a holistic study, we see a lot of efficiencies there. Similarly, with the reconductoring approaches, for the most part, we relied on that heavily because of the development benefits, but this is a complicated process, right? And there may be opportunities to build a handful of new build projects that could address several reconductoring projects. So that requires ongoing coordination amongst the utilities in the area. The reference case really, I think, sets the stage well for future interregional or interstate upgrades. So we feel really good about this portfolio's ability to address in-state constraints that will make it such that those interstate upgrades are not limited by in-state transmission issues. So, due to the autonomous nature of this study, we didn't take a region-wide approach looking at how to flows in from, Montana into Wyoming into Colorado and the benefits of this large overlay system, right? That type of work is really critical. And while we identified some kind of marginal interstate upgrades that we think are, maybe in scope of what CETA might pursue, we certainly didn't capture all of the feasible options in terms of regional alternatives. There are studies underway. So WestConnect is pursuing a 20-year study in this 24-25 planning cycle. And the West Tech effort, if you're familiar with that, is looking at an entire west-wide approach to planning. There's these studies I'm quite certain will identify overlays and upgrades that are multi-state in nature that'll impact Colorado and provide benefits to Colorado. And so, this work focusing on these in-state issues and that other work focusing on interstate issues, I think is a good view in terms of how to blend transmission futures for the state. Go to the next slide. So if high load growth and electrification does occur, our results conclude that transmission needs are going to change drastically. We've identified, 2 times the level of investment of what's in the reference case. So we forecasted a peak of 20 gigawatts by 2045. That's about, over 6 gigawatts higher than what's in our reference case. So if that comes to pass, the system does need substantial reinforcement. So we're not saying this is certainly going to happen, but it's a useful data point out there for Colorado stakeholders to understand potentially the implications of that. Finally, we did see that Colorado needs in state are not entirely sensitive to regional coordination and integration scenarios outside the state. So as it relates to the wind integration study, there are some additional upgrades, that we identified, but relative to the cost of the rest of the portfolio, we saw those upgrades as relatively small, so we do think the state is well positioned to integrate those resources in a lot of different places. And if this portfolio is built out, then those incremental upgrades are, I think, relatively small. And in that same vein, the portfolio is sufficient at building out a system that I think is robust against decisions in surrounding states and regions related to energy markets. So we didn't see congestion in Colorado and on the borders just drastically swing from one thing to another, depending on what other regions did in terms of markets. And so we think that's an important finding. And that's important because we think it means that some of this transmission investment is relatively low risk, perhaps, if we see these things not really change that much depending on how this market outcome play out, how these markets play out, which is a significant uncertainty that we have to deal with right now. So made it through all those, Kathy. We have some next steps, I think, but maybe we can hold that for a minute if you think, and then we can take questions. Or
yeah, I think that'd be great here in the last 10 minutes that we've got. If folks have questions, the roll up here of the initial findings, I'll pause for a minute and go ahead and raise your hand.
Anything that Tom mentioned or I mentioned previously. It's all on the table.
I see one coming in the chat. What sorts of environmental benefits will you be assessing from the Nature Conservancy?
Yeah, the methodology is we have a way to estimate reductions in in-state CO2 emissions, and we have methodologies to assign a social cost of carbon to those reductions and quantify that over a lifetime of the transmission asset and on a present value basis. So that's the approach that's taken. Just fairly standard, I would say.
Thank you, Harold. Okay, the room is quiet, both chat and hands. Well, Keegan, I guess if you want to move on to some of the next steps and see if
Vijay's
anything
got
else.
his hand up.
Vijay?
Looks like Vijay, yeah.
Thank you, Vijay WRA. I think you touched on this, but I apologize. I had to step away for a phone call, so I'm back. this last bullet in number 8, could you elaborate on this in a way that two questions I have. I know you didn't really model market constructs, but I'm curious about what does this study mean for inter-regional planning, and what could West Connect learn from this study?
I think the in-state upgrades, right? The portfolio of upgrades that we've identified for Colorado is going to be relevant in a lot of forums.
Right.
I hope regional planning forums, because it's a good source of concepts. It also, I hope, is helpful for local planning forums within Colorado. So I think there's a lot of potential uses for this work, not to mention a primary use, which is to feed information about a transmission roadmap and gaps to CETA. That's the primary purpose. But I do think there are some follow-on purposes, and we really do hope it's useful.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ben makes a good point about how to prioritize, because Kathy, we are going to ask. That is actually the primary purpose of the initial report. Is we agree, Ben, that there's a large set of projects, and in reality, which projects are built are going to be, unless it's a Texas CREZ build it and they will come type investment, which I don't think that's planned. It'll be in response to firm forecasts of resources and loads. And hopefully that build out will take place with this longer range future in mind. But how CETA exactly prioritizes individual projects to participate on, we are going to document this initial report, which is going to have all these projects, and we're going to ask stakeholders what they think, because we're not entirely sure, and we're not haven't had the chance to engage with the CETA board yet in detail either. And so I don't have a good feel of, hey, this was the type of thing we're looking for in terms of this specific type of projects relative to this one. Our initial view was that the greenfield projects perhaps are those that could use more leadership and de-risking and CETA's unique capabilities as it relates to right-of-way and some other functions. Whereas a lot of the reconductoring upgrades I see maybe as less, perhaps would rise to the top of the list for fewer CETA board members and be less of a strategic initiative. But I do not know that. A lot of that's a hypothesis at that point. So that's why we're going to float the question.
Okay, a couple hands coming up. Tyler. Or did you take yours down?
I was going to type it in the chat, but I'm just wondering, will the benefit analysis be done on like a portfolio basis or on a line basis? Okay.
It's going to be done on a portfolio basis.
And that will be like the reference case portfolio.
Yeah, that's what we're going to focus on. Yeah, okay. We're going to focus on the reference case and that. I think there's, I feel there's a little bit too much uncertainty to extend beyond that. We may try to roll some of the interstate upgrades into a version of that. That's our goal. So look for both of those.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. Jacob? And then I see we have Dan in the chat.
Hey, Keegan. Yeah, earlier this presentation, you mentioned like a LMP shadow price, and that's the first time I'd heard of that. So I was just wondering if you could provide some context to that and maybe how it's measured and whether or not you included that that metric in your analysis.
Yeah. So a shadow price, hoping not to have to do this. So a shadow price, it's a representation of reductions in system dispatch costs that would be achieved through adding an incremental megawatt of capacity to the constrained line in question. It's a technical definition of what that is. So it represents a transmission value, and congestion is really just an aggregation of shadow prices across a year, depending on the size of the line. So that's what that is. So it's not something we look at and kind of report, but it's embedded in the linear programming of the security constrained economic dispatch tool. So that's the answer to that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. Dan in the chat is asking, question for CETA. What follow-on work anticipated? Any future studies or cadence from what's next?
That's a great question for Maury.
So Dan and Ben have both asked the question, you know, how does CETA prioritize all of these opportunities that Keegan and the team have identified? We're going to take advantage of Keegan and the team for the remainder of this study, get some preliminary input from them on that idea. As Keegan mentioned, I think we're going to be putting that list out for stakeholder comment. We're going to get some preliminary input from stakeholders on that prioritization effort. But I think there is going to need to be a follow-on effort to this study to assist the board in prioritizing those opportunities and figuring out, you know, a small number to champion and actively seek partnerships on. I would hope that we can, you know, get to that as soon as possible. I'd like to be in the position to, you know, identify 2 or 3 projects that CETA could champion in the first half of 2025. But as you all know, you know, we do not have deep pockets and lots of funding. So we are actively looking for some support to help with that prioritization effort. And I think we'll ultimately be successful there, but it's a little uncertain at this time. So I'm hoping that that answers both Ben's question and Dan's question. And if they could let me know, that would be great.
Yeah, to answer Vijay's question, I think Maury just answered it, which is I think CETA is looking for guidance on how to prioritize these. And we've got some ideas, right? There's probably groups of projects that make sense. So you kind of maybe want them all in a given geographic area. So does that mean CETA endorses them, or do they pick the hardest one or the one that's brought forth first and then focus continued efforts in that area? So there's a lot of it's kind of a, there's not a lot of entities like CETA, and there's not been a lot of studies like this either. And so I think that it's a blank slate on how you implement it and go forward. So that's why we want to crowdsource ideas. So
Thank you. Vijay, I'm going to ask you to hold for just a minute and the team will stay on after to address your question, but we're just so we get all in here before folks wrap up. Keegan, if you want to go on to next steps, please.
Sure, just wrap. This will just take 1 minute. Go to the next slide and then the slide after, and then we just go next step. So we're in the throes of wrapping this up. So I mentioned some study work, but that study work in large part is not going to change the findings of the study, which is focused on these portfolios, the transmission needs, the gaps, and how we help CETA interpret this, right? That's the key thing we're trying to do. That's going to be the focus of what we talk about next month at a meeting with CPUC. It's August 26th. You're all invited to attend. I will be there in person. Tom will drive in. I think Kathy's going to be there. I know Maury's going to be there. Everybody's welcome to attend or call in. It'll essentially be a summary of what we've done, rolled up and tightened up and buttoned up, and we'll show the outcomes of this. We have some additional milestone, as I mentioned, the study work, and then this initial report, which is heavily focused on this list of projects. And then we'll have a final report that's going to be issued at the end of the year. Ultimately, it's going to have a technical section that'll be really a documentation of everything that we've been talking about the last several months. And so this will really just be a summary of methods. And then that list of projects is kind of the main outcome of this.
Thank you. And then very briefly, next slide. Just where you can go for information here. So transmission study webpage on the CETA site. There's lots of links in there of stakeholder comments, summaries from the team, progression of the work. So good repository there for you. The recording, the slide deck, and meeting summary from today will shortly be posted onto the website. If you're not getting those from me, there's my email. Please drop me an email and I'll add you to that distro list. And then as Keegan referred, presentation on August 26th, 9 to 10 a.m. I assume that will be also virtual availability, that they'll do a hybrid. We'll confirm with the PUC, but some of us will be there in person as well. And then watch for the initial report in early September. Thank you all. Well, maybe the team can stay on. There's a couple questions coming in the last minute here, but we appreciate everybody's work here and input. And really, again, as Keegan and Tom have referenced, stakeholder input has been very significant for this work and a really good guide for all of us to address questions, concerns, reorient where we may have gone astray. So really appreciate everybody's time and thought to make this a robust study. Thank you.
Thank you to Kathy, Keegan, Tom, Emily, the whole team. Great work, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maury. Thanks everybody for coming today. I'll stay on, Vijay, for you.